So there's this book written by a guy who becomes friend-zoned by a woman who barely knew he existed and that he met twice in his entire life. And his response is to write 14,000 lines of poetry where he personally designs a torture chamber for every single person who ever wronged him and calls it literature. This book is still taught in schools and is considered one of the greatest achievements of human civilization. And almost nobody can actually explain what's happening past, there's a guy, he goes to hell, it's bad down there. So let me fix that for you. Let's talk about the Divine Comedy, how a medieval Italian poet turned a breakup, a political grudge, and a midlife crisis into the blueprint for basically every afterlife story that came after it. First, our hero, Dante Alighieri. He's a poet from Florence in the late 1200s, a politician, a guy with some strong opinions, and most importantly, a guy on the losing side of Florentine politics. Florence was split between two factions, the Guelphs, mostly wealthy merchants who supported the Pope's political authority, and the Ghibellines, traditional aristocrats who wanted the city under the imperial rule of the Holy Roman Emperor. Then the Guelphs split again into two more factions, as if one civil war wasn't enough content for the city. The Blacks, who basically wanted the Pope to run the whole gang, and the Whites, including Dante, who supported the Pope but wanted him to keep his hands out of Florence's local politics. Our Dante obviously ends up on the wrong side of the wrong split, and in 1302 he gets permanently exiled from Florence under threat of being burned alive if he ever even thought of coming back. He never saw his home city again, so he spent the rest of his life bouncing between courts in northern Italy, writing, and we can only assume, cooking. And cooking is really an understatement here because the Divine Comedy is not some detached philosophical tour of the afterlife written by a guy with no personal stake in any of it. Dante wrote himself into his own poem as the main character, guided through hell, purgatory, and paradise, and along the way he runs into an enormous cast of real historical people, many of whom he personally knew, to which he assigns punishments based on what he thought they deserved. Political rivals, corrupt clergy, all of them, sorted into very specific circles of hell with very specific and thematically appropriate torments. Before any of that though, there's a detail that gets skipped constantly, which is that Dante doesn't even title this thing the Divine Comedy. He called it just the comedy, and back then this word didn't mean funny, it meant a story that starts bad and ends well, as opposed to a tragedy which starts well and ends badly. The divine got tacked on centuries later by editors who figured that a poem about God, sin, and the entire structure of the afterlife probably deserved a slightly more impressive cover. Dante himself never saw that title in his lifetime. Something else that people forget is that he even puts a sitting pope in hell. Pope Boniface VIII, who was very much still alive when Dante started writing this thing, gets a spot reserved for him among the simoniacs, the corrupt officials who sold church positions for money, stuffed upside down in bedrock with flames burning the soles of his feet. Dante didn't wait for the guy to die to condemn him and spoiled his ending in advance. That's not really something you do to someone you're neutral about. Okay, but what actually happens in this thing? The poem is split into three parts: Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, Hell, Purgatory, and Heaven. Dante, lost in a dark wood at the midpoint of his life, meets the ghost of the Roman poet Virgil, who's going to be his guide through the first 2/3 of the journey. And this is where it gets interesting, because Virgil can only take him so far. Virgil lived and died before Christianity existed, so as a virtuous pagan, but he doesn't get into heaven. Instead, he's stuck in limbo, the outermost ring of hell, which Dante designed as this weirdly peaceful area for good people who just happen to be born in the wrong century for salvation. Homer's there, Socrates is there, Julius Caesar is there. It's basically a very exclusive VIP lounge for history's most respected pagans, and none of them are getting out. Now, surprisingly, hell in this poem has actual bureaucracy. There's this dude, Charon, a ferryman who transports souls across the river Acheron into hell. And he got lifted more or less straight out of Greek mythology, because Dante was more than happy to mix pagan cosmology into his very Catholic afterlife whenever it suited the story. Once you're actually inside, there's a judge, Minos, who sits at the entrance to the deeper circles and physically wraps his tail around himself a certain number of times to indicate which circle a soul is assigned to. Oh, and by the way, this is somehow one of the more normal details in this book. From Limbo, Dante and Virgil descend through the rest of the 9 circles of hell, and each circle represents and punishes a different category of sin. And the punishments are built on a principle called contrapasso, where the punishment mirrors the sin itself, either in a twisted way or as its exact ironic opposite. Circle 2 is lust. Here we find the souls of those who let desire override reason, and now they spend eternity caught in a violent endless storm, blown around in the dark with no control over where they go. This is also where where we meet Francesca da Rimini, a real historical woman who had an affair with her husband's brother Paolo and was killed for it. Dante tells her story with a level of sympathy that feels almost like a mistake. He listens to her tale of how she fell in love while reading a book together, and then faints from pity at the end of the canto. He put her in hell and then couldn't fully bring himself to condemn her while writing it. When he wakes up, he's in Circle 3, Gluttony, a place guarded by Cerberus, the three-headed dog pulled straight out of Greek mythology. And here, Glutton's lie face down in freezing, filthy slush, endlessly rained on and clawed at by the dog. Because in life, they cared about nothing but physical pleasure, and now that's all there is, minus the pleasure part. Circle 4 is greed, split between two groups who never actually interact with each other despite sharing a circle: the hoarders and the wasters. People who either clutched their money too tightly or threw it away too carelessly, and their punishment is to spend eternity pushing enormous weights against each other in an endless collision, slamming into one another, then turning around and doing it again. Forever. Circle 5 is Wrath, and this is where the geography gets interesting, because the circle is built around the river Styx, and the openly wrathful are stuck fighting each other on the surface of the muddy water, tearing at each other with their teeth, while beneath the surface are the sullen, the people whose anger never came out, who just sat on it silently their whole lives, and now they're literally submerged, gurgling a hymn they can't finish because there's mud in their throats. Circle 6 is Heresy, a field of open, flaming tombs where heretics lie forever burning inside the very things they built their reputations on. This is where Dante runs into Farinata degli Uberti, a real Florentine political leader from a rival faction, who rises up out of his burning tomb mid-conversation looking, in Dante's own words, like he has nothing but contempt for hell itself. Circle 7 is Violence, and it's big enough that Dante splits it into 3 separate rings. The outer ring punishes violence against others, and it's a river of boiling blood called Phlegathon, patrolled by centaurs firing arrows at anyone who tries to climb out. The middle ring punishes violence against yourself, meaning suicides. And this is maybe the most visually strange punishment in the entire poem, because the souls here are transformed into gnarled, leafless trees, permanently rooted, and the only way they can speak is if a branch is broken off them, causing them to bleed and cry out in pain, since in life they rejected their own bodies, so now they don't get bodies at all, just bark. The inner ring punishes violence against God, nature, or art, and it's a desert of burning sand under a constant rain of fire, home to blasphemers lying flat on their backs, and usurers sitting hunched with purses hanging around their necks, staring at their own money bags in disgust for eternity. Circle 8 is Fraud, and it's the most elaborate section of the entire Inferno, called the Malabolge, which just means evil pouches, 10 separate ditches, each one punishing a different specific flavor of deliberate deception. Panderers and seducers get whipped by demons in an endless procession. Flatterers are submerged in human excrement, because that's roughly Dante's opinion of flattery as a category. Simoniacs, the corrupt clergy who sold church offices for money, the same group that gets Pope Boniface, are stuffed headfirst into holes in the rock with only their burning feet sticking out. At this point, you realize Dante wasn't just writing poetry, he was flexing how deeply unhinged his imagination could get. And then right at the bottom, Circle 9. Treachery, frozen waist deep and deeper in a lake of ice called Cocytus, because the deepest sin in Dante's cosmology is betrayal. This circle is split into 4 zones, each one worse than the last. Cana punishes those who betrayed their own family. Antenora punishes those who betrayed their political party or homeland, named after the Trojan who supposedly betrayed Troy. And this is where Dante puts his old rival Count Ugolino, frozen next to the archbishop who betrayed and starved him and his sons to death, gnawing eternally on the back of the man's skull. Ptolemaea punishes those who betrayed their own guests. And Judeca, the very center, punishes those who betrayed their benefactors, named directly after Judas. And at the absolute bottom of Judeca, waist deep in ice himself, flapping 3 sets of bat wings that generate the very wind that keeps the whole lake frozen, is the big boss himself, Satan. 3-faced, 1 head red, 1 black, 1 pale yellow, chewing eternally on 3 of history's most infamous traitors, 1 mouth each. Judas Iscariot for betraying Christ, Brutus and Cassius for betraying Julius Caesar, which tells you a lot about what Dante considered the 2 worst betrayals in human history, betraying God and betraying Rome. Political loyalty was not a small thing to this man, and it's worth remembering that Satan isn't even doing anything dynamic down here. He's not orchestrating hell or chilling as he lets his minions run around. He's just stuck like everyone else, weeping and chewing, the most powerless character in the entire poem, despite being the one everyone's afraid of. After hell, Virgil leads Dante up Mount Purgatory, which is this genuinely strange geographic idea Dante basically invented for the poem, a literal mountain on the opposite side of the world from Jerusalem, formed, according to Dante's internal logic, when Satan fell from heaven and hit the earth so hard the impact pushed up land on the far side. Before you even get to the terraces, there's an entire waiting area called Ante-Purgatory for people who repented late or were excommunicated, or were too busy ruling their kingdoms badly to think about their souls until the very end, and they have to wait outside for a length of time roughly equal to how long they put off getting their act together while alive, which is a very interesting design for a mountain that's supposed to be about forgiveness. Purgatory is structured as 7 terraces, one for each of what we now call the 7 deadly sins, ordered from the worst offense against love at the bottom to the mildest near the top, and the punishments here are less about torment and more about correction. On the first terrace, the proud carry enormous stone slabs on their backs, forcing them to walk permanently bent double, in the posture of humility they never had in life. On the second terrace, the envious have their eyelids sewn shut with iron wire, because they spent their lives unable to stop looking at what other people had, so now they can't look at anything at all. On the third terrace, the wrathful walk through a thick, blinding smoke that represents the way anger clouds judgment. On the fourth terrace, the slothful run constantly, without stopping, shouting examples of zeal and diligence to each other, because they spent life being too sluggish to act, so now they physically cannot stand still. On the fifth terrace, the avaricious and the prodigal lie face down on the ground, unable to lift themselves up because they let their focus in life fix entirely on material things below them, so now that's literally all they can see. On the sixth terrace, the gluttonous stand starving beneath fruit trees they can smell but can never reach, watching the fruit stay permanently just out of range. On the seventh and final terrace, the lustful walk through an actual wall of flame, the only way to cross to the top of the mountain, purifying the very desire that once controlled them. It's hell's logic run in reverse, punishment as therapy instead of punishment as sentence, until at the very top there's the Garden of Eden itself, the earthly paradise, waiting for whoever makes it that far. After finally arriving on top of Purgatory, Virgil has to leave. It's that devastating episode in a show where the mentor realizes they've taught the protagonist everything they can, and they just disappear from the cast list. He disappears without ceremony, mid-canto, and Dante doesn't even get a proper goodbye. He just turns around at some point mid-conversation and Virgil's gone. And guess who shows up to take over as guide through paradise? Beatrice, the Florentine woman Dante met exactly twice in his life, according to his own earlier writing, once when they were both children and once years later on a street in Florence, and who died young in her early 20s, having basically no personal relationship with Dante beyond those 2 encounters. He idealized her so much that by the time he wrote the comedy, decades later, she'd become his personal stand-in for divine love itself, the one being pure enough to guide him through the 9 spheres of heaven and eventually into the presence of God. The woman barely knew him. He built her an entire afterlife role. Paradise itself is honestly the part fewest people finish, and, well, it's not hard to see why. After the visceral horror of hell and the strange moral engineering of purgatory, heaven in Dante's version trades physical punishment for pure structure, and it's built entirely on the medieval understanding of the cosmos, which put the earth at the center of everything, surrounded by 9 concentric rotating spheres. Moon, broken vows under pressure. Mercury, good deeds done for the applause. Venus, people who loved too hard, including a scandalous noblewoman Dante lets straight into heaven for the exact thing he sent Francesca to the storm for back in hell. The sun is a blazing ring of theologians, dancing like the universe's nerdiest book club. Mars is warriors arranged into a glowing cross, and it's the gut punch sphere, because Dante's own dead ancestor shows up and tells him in advance that exile's coming, and this poem is what's going to save his name. Jupiter's just rulers spell a Bible verse in the sky in light, then fold into a giant eagle. Subtlety was never the point. Saturn, monks and silence, because Dante says the music up here would kill a mortal ear. Then the fixed stars, where Peter, James, and John pop quiz him on faith, hope, and love like a final exam run by the apostles, right before Christ blows the whole sky open with light. Then the primum mobile, just angels spinning faster the closer to center, the engine room for everything below. And past all of it, past vast space itself, the Empyrean, pure light, souls stacked into one massive glowing rose, everyone seeing everyone and God at once. And there, after 100 cantos and 15 years of writing, Dante finally looks at God and says on the page, he doesn't have the words for it. Hell of a note to end on. All that detail, tail wraps and eagles made of kings, and the one moment it was all building to, he just shrugs. What's easy to miss underneath all the theology and the personal grudges is how radical the whole project actually was as a piece of writing. Dante wrote the entire comedy not in Latin, which was the language of serious literature and scholarship at the time, but in the Florentine vernacular, the actual spoken Italian of ordinary people. That was a genuinely bold choice, treating the language people used at markets and dinner tables as worthy of an epic about God, sin, and the structure of the universe. And it worked well enough that Dante's Tuscan dialect became the foundation for what eventually standardized into modern Italian. There's a real argument that the language you'd hear on a street in Florence or Rome or Milan today exists in its current form partly because one exiled poet decided his revenge fanfiction deserved to be written in the language his readers actually spoke. So that's the Divine Comedy, 100 cantos, 3 afterlives, a cast list of popes, poets, emperors, and personal enemies, all sorted by a man who never got to go home, guided first by a pagan he clearly respected more than most Christians he'd met, and then by a woman who probably couldn't have picked him out of a crowd. It's a poem about sin and salvation and the architecture of the universe, sure, but it's also, underneath all of that, the most elaborate, most beautifully written act of getting the last word that anyone has ever produced. He didn't just write himself into the afterlife, he decided who else got to come with him and exactly what they'd be doing there forever.